what drew all of you into the genre of sci-fi and fantasy to begin with. So since we went clockwise, let's go counterclockwise this time. So Natalie, what brought you to the sci-fi genre to begin with?
That's fair. I deliberately wore this shirt. I'm hoping that you guys can see it.
Yes.
Okay. So let's see. So Friday was my birthday.
Oh,
So
happy birthday.
thank you.
Birthday.
I actually didn't say that to get that. It does seem that way, but no. But I purchased for myself. I was in the mood to purchase a bunch of Black Panther Storm shirts, and I was like, you know what? It fit in perfectly. I was going to pick one to wear today because it really goes back to the reason why I started writing. And I think we all know about Black Panther Storm, but years ago, Reginald Hudlin, he was hired to write, to take over at that time the Black Panther comics, and he was brought in to write not only Black Panther's comic, but to bring in Storm or her from the X-Men, because they were going to marry them together, and I mean marry them off, and that was just unheard of at the time. And I was like, oh really? It totally interested me, so I just jumped on. I love anime, I love comics, and if you can put in romance in that mix. But I love that idea. I love it. And it fits what I personally like, but we just don't see it. Even now, about maybe a decade later, it's still a very rare phenomenon to see that Black love, to see it appreciated, to see it done well. I think Coates, he just finished up a few months back on that series with the Black Panther, and I thought he did an amazing job writing Storm, and the Black Panther, or the character of T'Challa, and what he added in as far as them being individuals and not just these heroes. So that was really me. I enjoyed reading it. I wanted more. It simply did not exist. And I'm like, you know what? I can write that. So I actually started writing a bit of fan fiction first, and just dip my little foot in the water with that. And it just grew into me deciding, you know what? I'm spending all this time writing other people's characters. I need to create my own. And so that's exactly what I did. So my first full-length novel, which is entitled Death and Destiny, it included witches and shapeshifters, and it was because of my love of Storm and Black Panther.
I love it. I love it. I feel like we all have a beautiful origin story. So Leslie, would you like to share yours?
Yeah, my mother's favorite TV show was The Twilight Zone. And so I grew up watching Twilight Zone and Outer Limits. And I think that's where the origination of my love of speculative fiction, sci-fi, and fantasy started. And I remember as a kid, I read Virginia Hamilton's books, which were like Justice and Her Brothers. They were Black, kids going on these kind of science fictional adventures. And I didn't read exclusively sci-fi more like until I got out of college, or in college is when I discovered Octavia Butler. And then I kind of dove into sci-fi. I was never a huge fantasy reader until later. And then even later, I think it was like late 20s, I started reading romance. And I started with Nalini Singh and Chelsea Cole. So I started with canon romance. And then I got into all the other subgenres of romance from there. So yeah, it's just kind of a lifelong love of anything different, like out of this world, anything speculative, anything with a little bit of either magic or fantastical or like, extra technology. I was here for all of it.
That's the beautiful thing about fantasy. It's just like there's so much in it to just like latch onto, and it's like you can grab onto it even when you're a kid and you have no idea how it's working or why you love it so much. You can just love it and be like, yep, and it stays with you, So Alyssa, do you want to share how did you get into the sci-fi fantasy and grow your love for it?
A bit of a combination of both of you guys' stories. I, as a kid, like my parents loved sci-fi stuff, horror shows, Twilight Zone, Outer Limits, like you said, also Star Trek, and like basically anything sci-fi and nerdy that was coming on, in addition to everything else. And then I discovered comic books and manga as a kid, reading things that I should not have been reading. And anime, because, you know, my parents would, you know, we had like a really cool video store that just had all of this variety that was not available at the local Blockbuster. So we got to watch all of these different things. And yeah, and like as far as reading, I was reading like, I guess not fantasy, but I mean, I read a bit of everything, but I actually really loved horror and science fiction. Like I started reading Stephen King way too young. To people probably heard this story before, but like when I started trying to read The Shining when I was like 7, because it had like a shiny. I don't know if you remember, it had a shiny. The first one had like a kind of mirror cover, and I was like, oh, this is cool. And I started reading it, and I got really scared, so I went and hid it on my sister's side of the room, my older sister's side of the room, like under all her stuff, because, you know, nothing, she was scarier than anything in The Shining. I did not think anything, I did not think the woman in 237 could beat my sister, so I was like, I'm just gonna put this over here. And I didn't get back to that, but, you know, that was when I kind of fell in love with horror. And one of the things that, like, when I was a kid, I always noticed is that I would sometimes see books with people that look like me and my family and my friends, but not usually. So even when I was a kid and I was like drawing and writing and, you know, and I loved X-Men because of Storm, of course. And like, I'm wearing my little Dora Milaje shirt.
There you go.
And the comics and things where I could see myself, and I like, you know, sometimes I've seen people say like, hey, I didn't think that we could exist in these kinds of worlds, and I was like, no, we do. Like, I see us there, but just not enough. And so I always kind of had this desire to create worlds that reflected the world that I lived in and in reality. And I always loved love stories as well. And when I first started writing, actually, my first like thing that ever got published was like a fantasy, kind of contemporary fantasy romance. And I have in my little files like a bunch of unfinished paranormal romances from before I got published. The first thing that got published was like romantic suspense, but the first series was Sci-Fi. So basically, like just all of the nerdy stuff I loved as a kid and picked up on from my parents and my family kind of still dictate what I write today.
I love it. And I'm not gonna lie, I love that you hid the book in your sister's stuff. And because I really thought you were gonna be like, I hid under her bed. Like, no, I hid the book.
It's like, it can stay over there.
So what about you, Amanda? What brought you to this realm of creativity, of sci-fi?
Well, it's very much a combination of everybody else, you know, that commonality. But for me, it was also, my mom is a huge Anne Rice fan, and my father was a huge Lord of the Rings fan. And so I got this kind of combination of horror, vampire, kind of living in a modern world, along with the epicness of Lord of the Rings mixed together. Plus X-Files, plus all of the horror movies that I grew up with my siblings not letting me like watch, but also letting me watch when they would watch me. So Chucky and all of that. And it all mixed for me into a love of fantasy that leans more towards the dark side and has a bit of a horror element to it, but also that kind of has a bit of a social commentary and then examines the way that we as Black people move in the world. And when I started writing, I knew that it was important to write that and write Black characters, but also I'm a bisexual woman, so I knew that that was important for me as well, to write, you know, LGBTQ plus characters into these fantasy narratives front and center, and as friends, but also as loved ones and as main characters, and not just existing on the fringes. So all of that, and yeah, it's also my favorite genre to read. I usually gravitate towards it as well. So I thought, if I'm consuming this in such a high rate, why not try to throw my hat in the ring and write it as well?
That makes sense. I mean, I love how all of you, while you're telling your stories, it's like it started out with my parents, but then I quickly developed a love for it and I just clung to it and started writing in the genre. So, with that being said, it's like, do you guys feel like it's important, specifically not just for romance elements to be included in sci-fi fantasy, but to have that element of Black love? Because I don't know if you guys have seen it on the interwebs or the Twitterverse or whatever, but the conversation between a Black author writing a romance versus a Black love story, which is between two main characters. I would like to know, what is your take on that discussion, and then also how do you feel it's important to include it? Because it's important. Everybody's answers somewhat included some aspect of that. So, let's just do popcorn. I feel like a teacher again. Okay, we got random. Alyssa, how do you feel about it? What's your take on it?
My take on it is like this. I think it's important I often honestly get confused by the kind of constant conversation about this, because clearly there are two different kinds of stories. Well, not different, but the difference between Black love, Black romance. I think it's really important, clearly, to have stories featuring two Black protagonists falling in love, because that is something that's super, super underrepresented in pop culture. Because, I mean, I won't, but I can talk on the whole for the entire rest of this thing about how society at large likes to pretend that Black people don't have emotions. I mean, if you think about in medicine, thinking that we don't feel pain in the same way, there's also the perception that we don't feel love in the same way, and that we don't fall in love. And that's a huge issue in romance that is kind of always the elephant in the room when we're talking about Black love and romance and Black characters in romance, because people kind of sometimes are like, well, why would they be in a romance? Like they're not saying that, but that's the underlying thing. We wouldn't have to have diversity issues if people thought that Black people could just fall in love like anyone else. Okay, I said I wasn't going to speak for the whole rest. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay, but I do think that it's important to have books with two Black protagonists. But I also do think if a Black writer is writing a book that's a multicultural romance, it's also not the same as if a Black person was writing a book. I feel like there are degrees to it. I would say that a book between a multicultural or interracial romance is a Black love story, but I also think that it is not the same as if a white writer wrote an interracial romance, because the character, even if they are not Black, are going to be shaped by the worldview and the understanding and experiences of the Black author. So I think, like, often when I see this thing, I'm like, can we just talk about what books we actually like instead of arguing about? Because a lot of times it's just like this conversation. And I'm like, okay, well, just recommend books. Like, tell me about books that you enjoyed reading. And because I feel like it's kind of like an obvious thing that gets like every other month on Twitter, you open it and there's like the whole conversation about it. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, are we going to keep having this 101 conversation but that's like everything in romance. So it's not just this. It's not everything on Twitter.
Everything on Twitter when it comes to romance, it's just like, here's an argument, I present it to you, and it's just like, we don't need to have an argument about it.
I do think it's important, and I would just also really love if a lot of the energy was spent highlighting the work of authors and books that feature Black love stories instead of like talking about the definition of it.
That's fair. That's fair. So I feel like it's kind of all encompassing, but Leslie, would you like to give your take on it as well? Like, how do you feel about the Black love and the importance of two Black characters in fantasy falling in love?
Well, in fantasy, it's even more rare than in anything else, since Black characters are more rare in fantasy. So, for me, it was really important to have Black love. My series, a lot of people say that there's like two races in Earthinger Chronicles, and one is darker skinned, one is lighter skinned. And I don't mention skin color in the first two books at all. I purposefully don't mention skin color. So people read these characters as coded as white because they have red hair, but I have plenty of Black friends and family members who have red hair. So I didn't mention skin color because I wanted to just like address the default situation where people, if you don't say it on the page, then they automatically assume that a character is white regardless. And like my characters are Black unless I tell you otherwise. So Black is a range in skin color and hair